G'day. Welcome to the Agricoach podcast for families on the land who want to grow their family's wealth and prosperity across the generations. I'm your host, Ben Law, and I'm the Financial Bloke. Welcome back to the Agricoach Wealth and Wisdom podcast. My name's Ben Law, and I'm the Financial Bloke. In this episode, I'm sitting in the guest chair again, having a conversation with David Egerton-Warburton, Joint CEO of Agrimaster and host of the Boots Off Log On podcast. So you might be asking, why am I sharing this episode with you? Well, the number one question I always get asked is, does podcasting as the Financial Bloke actually pay the bills, Ben? And to be frank, it doesn't, but my coaching business does. So in this episode, I'll give you a sense of what I'm truly passionate about and what my day job actually is all about. Now, Agricoach is centered around aligning families, growing family wealth, and protecting family legacies. So we discuss the challenges that come with growing wealth in farming families, from the high cost of scaling operations and the next generation's struggles to the complexities of estate and succession planning. I'll share why communication and trust and proper preparation are crucial for successful succession planning, and how becoming a high-performing family is key to sustaining both wealth and relationships across the generations. So without further delay, let's get cracking.
Let's say we bring it back to 100 million even over the next 30 or 40 years, and your kids inherit $100 million off you. What the hell is that going to do to their lives? Are they going to have the skills to manage that money? And if they have got some idea, what about your grandkids? And so that money could actually become a curse. Whereas if it's tied up in a farm and someone inherits a farm, well, then it doesn't matter whether the farm's worth $10 million or $100 million. It's tied up in a farm, and it's what you can make off that asset. So yeah, I think it's an awful problem that a lot of people aren't talking about. And so the number one problem is, if you are going to sell the farm, or if you are going to do a succession and then transition cash or other assets to non-farm siblings, are they going to be prepared enough to deal with that $1 million, $10 million, $20 million, and what impact will it have on the family?
Welcome to Boots Off, Log On, a podcast where we talk all things farm business, a show about the business of farming, bringing you insights and wisdom from the leaders in farm business, helping you minimize risk and maximize return on all your hard work. I'm David, and I'll be your host for the show.
G'day everybody, and welcome back to the podcast. Wealth management and succession are always big topics of concern in farming families, and this is only heightened as land values continue to grow. So in this episode, we dive into the intricate world of wealth and succession planning for farming families with Ben Law from Agricoach. Ben has over 20 years of experience professionally advising and coaching rural producers, giving him a unique understanding of the process and strategies necessary for successful farm financial and wealth management. We often think wealth solves all our problems, but our chat reveals that this is far from the truth. Instead, we talk about how it forms its own problems, and we dive into tackling the so-called three-generation curse and why proactive wealth management is crucial to sidestep its traps. We talk about what farmers need to do to look beyond the farm and focus on long-term family wealth management, and how to address succession and wealth transfer issues before they arise. We discuss how communication, trust breakdowns, lack of preparation for the next generation, and the lack of an aligned strategic plan can cause successions to fail. The role of family values and leadership in succession planning is a big highlight here. As usual, this was an engaging conversation packed with insights and practical advice. Enjoy. Now over to Ben. Ben, welcome to the podcast, mate. And yeah, good to have you here.
Mate, super excited to be on the other side of the desk, so to speak, David.
I know you're used to doing the interviewing, mate. So what's it like being a guest for once?
It's fun, actually. The first one I did, David, I remember someone I went to introduce the guest, the person that was interviewing me. It was just naturally being built into me. So it does take a few minutes just to be able to change it around and realize that I've got to listen and I've got to be still curious enough to listen, but I'm not the one that's asking the questions. It does take a bit of adjustment.
Yeah, but I might be doing some gotchas in this interview, mate, and you might not be ready for it, and, I'm going to throw you.
Mate, I might not be the smartest tool in the toolbox, but I'm pretty quick on my feet. Give it
All right, no worries, mate. So let's get into you, mate. So you are an agri-wealth coach, which is, if you come from urban areas, most people go, really? An agri-wealth coach? And you really deal with these large-scale, multi-generational families with strategic planning, succession stuff, estate management, etc. So you're going to introduce your business, and you're also a podcaster with your podcast, The Financial Bloke. So can you introduce you? And that's an interesting portfolio of jobs to be done each day for you. So tell me, who is the Financial Bloke, and tell me about your wealth coaching and also your podcast, and so people know who we're talking to today.
Fantastic. No, very happy to. I'll try and keep it short and sharp because I'm not known for that, David. But I grew up on a cattle property in northwest New South Wales. I would have been the fourth generation to come back onto the farm if we'd had an appropriate succession plan in place, but we didn't. I went off into the world with my mother's words ringing in my ears, which was get a financial education and don't be like us. I went off to uni, studied economics, finance, worked in financial advice. I worked for a hedge fund in London, which is a complete other story, managing about $23 billion, and fell into financial advice and spent 25 years doing financial advice, which sort of dates me, which I probably shouldn't do, but it dates me. Spent 25 years doing financial advice. And in 2020, I retired from financial advice, took a year off, and then thought, what the bloody hell am I going to do now? I can't just be retired at 42. I've got to find something to do. And I'd started The Financial Bloke because as a financial advisor, David, I could only help a small number of families. And I figured the biggest gap for most farming families was education, and someone that had both a farming knowledge, but also the financial knowledge about how to grow, build, and transition wealth. And I started the podcast, and I think we're up to 75 or 78 episodes now. And I essentially interviewing people that are technically based. So the sort of technical stuff around finance, legal, tax, structuring, and then also what I call high performing families. So families that are really successful in that space. And so what I do, just to get right to the crux, I call myself a strategic coach. I work with helping families avoid what I call the 3-generation curse. And I do that by helping them become what I call high-performing families.
And high-performing families is something that, at one point within each of our regions around Australia and in the world, everyone knew there was one or two, those big families who somehow through the generations had done well, and they were the big farmers in town. Everyone knew the big farmer in town, right? But in the last probably decade, we've seen a really large increase in farm size, farm wealth, and especially in the recent, probably the last 2 or 3 years. I think, we're getting a 36% increase in land prices a year sort of thing. So it was getting ridiculous. So one of our consulting firms that we work closely with, Plan Farm here in the West, their benchmarks from 2022, the average business in their benchmark basically had averaged out around 22 million. So when you talk an average of 22 million, also they're running equities at that point around 93% with a value of 22 million. So, the big farmer in town is almost most farmers in town these days. So this idea of managing that wealth has become a whole new challenge in itself, hasn't it been?
Yeah, it has. It has. And I just want to clarify something. When I describe high-performing families, they're not necessarily the biggest in town, shall I say.
Mm.
But they're the ones that are able to create wealth, family wealth, so that's usually farming assets, etc. And they're able to do that well, and they're able to sustain that over the generations. Because the 3-generation curse I mentioned is essentially 2 to make it, 1 to lose it, which is endemic. So they're not necessarily the biggest, but they're the most successful and sustainable over the long term. And that does require scale and it does require growth. I agree, but it's not necessarily the biggest. And Gina Reinhardt is a perfect example of that. She's the wealthiest woman in Australia, but you can see what's happening to her family and what's going to be lost.
Yeah, and when I was on my ride this morning, I was talking to my mate Dave, and he was going, "Who are you interviewing today?" I was talking Ben, and I was talking about what you do, and he was saying, "Yeah, this is the same as we experience here, like Gina's one of our locals here in Perth, and it's in the papers all the time, the dysfunction of very large, wealthy families. Generally, they're large, the ones that hit the paper, all the ones that are, have generational wealth that aren't big and giant, don't have a public we don't hear about, and they're the ones generally you're dealing about. They're not going to end up in the paper, hopefully. But it is a common challenge across family businesses. We see it play out in Sydney. We see it play out in London, where you worked for a while. We see it play out everywhere, these multi-generational families who have wealth that's almost a curse, could you say it, in some ways?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's like the lotto winners. What is it? 90% of lotto winners bankrupt within the first few years. So absolutely, it can be definitely a blessing for a family, but it also can be a curse.
And I think when I talked to you originally, that was probably the biggest thing, is the insight I got from you, Ben, was you had clients who come to you and they thought that they'd solved their primary problems because they had wealth. In other words, they could, okay, we can set everyone up. And that's, as parents, what we want. I'm thinking about my 3 boys and property prices and all that. You're thinking about that all the time as a parent. But sometimes it's not always a good thing, especially when you start talking tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, do you?
Yeah, well, the discussion, just for everyone listening, is I had this beautiful discussion with someone who has a farm here in Queensland, and I think it was worth something like $30 million. And they're coming up to retirement, and they said, look, none of our kids want to come back to the farm. And they said, so that makes it really easy for us. We don't need to worry about succession. We don't need to worry about that. And my comment to them was, well, you've actually got a worse problem. And they looked at me and said, why have I got a worse problem? I said, well, you're, mid-50s. Let's say another 10 years, that 30 million doubles. Because on average, if you're getting roughly every 7 years, if you're getting a 7% return, your asset will double in every 10 years. So your 30 million in 10 years will be 60 million. You're 65. Let's say you live till you're 85, another 2 sessions. Well, that goes from 60 to 120 to 240 million. Now, we can all argue whether that mass will keep going down the track. Let's say we bring it back to 100 million even over the next 30 or 40 years, and your kids inherit $100 million off you. What the hell is that going to do to their lives? Are they going to have the skills to manage that money? And if they have got some idea, what about your grandkids? And so that money could actually become a curse. Whereas if it's tied up in a farm and someone inherits a farm, well then, it doesn't matter whether the farm's worth $10 million or $100 million. It's tied up on a farm, and it's what you can make off that asset. So I think it's an awful problem that a lot of people aren't talking about. And so the number one problem is, if you are going to sell the farm, or if you are going to do a succession and then transition cash or other assets to non-farm siblings, are they going to be prepared enough to deal with that $1 million, $10 million, $20 million, and what impact will it have on the family? And I'll give you an example. I had a mate of mine recently where his wife, her mum and dad sold the farm at 75, and they got $50 million for the cattle property. They deposited $14 million into her bank account.
Wow.
No idea how to manage it. No idea what to do, because mum and dad said, we don't need all this money. We'll hand some off to you with all good intention. He said, now we're sitting there with $14 million in the bank. We don't need to work. Our kids don't need to work. And it's caused massive strain. So people aren't thinking through the next logical step, which is, we've got a succession plan, the farm, but what about the family wealth? And I want farmers and graziers to think more about wealth than farm. And I think when they start thinking about wealth and are we good custodians of the family wealth, that's when we get a paradigm shift and a change.
And we see this at a really, I don't know if you call it a small scale, but this problem happens even in young people. Like, for example, football clubs, whether they in any code now. Well, I know definitely in the AFL. I don't know NRL so much, but you get in this, what wealth does, even mini wealth, is that you get a young guy in the AFL get drafted, and suddenly he's on, I don't know what they start on, 90 to 100K. So you got a 17-year-old kid given this 100,000. He's gone from zero living at home with mum and dad to 100K, right? And they knew how much we've seen it play out in the papers, the sort of damage that does, right? But now I know the clubs, basically, as soon as they're drafted, they're given a financial advisor, they're given all this other stuff to stop the money causing damage, because they know when you're 17, 100 grand's a lot of money, yeah? And so it used to cause a lot of damage. So now they have strategies in place to help them deal with that.
Yeah.
And you're talking 17 million. That's a whole nother level of drama.
Absolutely. And this is playing out all over the place. We're just not talking about it yet. And, when you look at succession now, you can start to see, and I've got a lot of mates that are lawyers, so I think lawyers do a great job, but there's also a very big industry in what we call estate litigation, which is essentially you die, your money goes into your estate, you divide your money up, and then if there's a dispute over that estate, well, then all of a sudden the lawyers come in and they have a conflict, shall we say, over the estate. Now, back in the day, if you had 500 grand in the estate or $1 million in the estate, there's not a big bucket. But if you've got 5, 10, or as you said, that average of 22 million falls into an estate, you imagine the feeding frenzy that you'll get in an estate if the estate has to pay all the legal costs, which is what happens in this day and age.
I remember back when you're probably similar. Well, I don't know what vintage you are, but probably I assume similar-ish vintage to me. But I can remember 20 years ago, it was in Sydney, was it the Transfield family? I remember. And it was just 2 or 3 brothers just fighting it out in court for decades. It was in the paper every single month, like the Transfield brothers going at each other in court.
Yeah.
And that's sort of like the extreme end of what you're talking about, isn't it?
Well, it's Gina Reinhardt, and I don't mean to disparage Gina in any way, shape, or form. I'm sure they're all trying to do their best, etc. But they're in court fighting over the kids. Essentially, my understanding is they're fighting with Gina, saying, "Well, we want more billions." When you've got billions and you want more billions, something's gone wrong. Now, you said before, the larger families. Would you call them a high-performing family? I wouldn't. I wouldn't like to live in that world. Yeah, I'd like to have a billion. Well, no, would I like it? I wouldn't like $1 billion. But if I had $1 billion, that would fix a lot of the problems that we have in our lives. But it also creates a lot more. So there's far more to this than money. And I think 2 things that farmers make a big mistake with: I've got more money, so therefore I have less problems. And that is totally untrue. Problems don't disappear. They evolve, David. They don't ever disappear. Number 2 is they think if I'm a bloody good operator and I know how to run my farm really well, and I teach my son, daughter, or sons and daughters how to run the farm well, I'm going to be successful and the succession plan is going to work. And it couldn't be further from the truth. Now, there's some key reasons why, but it doesn't correlate.
Yeah, I can't remember who I read, but they said the money just buys you a better class of problem.
Yeah, higher value problems, I call it. And I love to trade low value problems for higher value problems, and having the problems that money gives you is a much better problem to deal with.
So that gets into it. And like you said, functionality is not a function of wealth. So we all know it's been the dream that's been peddled on the internet for probably the last, 20 years, this instant wealth, isn't it? Right. So we've had a generation brought up on this idea that instant wealth is the goal. But we've seen the result of anyone, the tiny percentage of people who do get instant wealth. And that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about, like you're talking about even Gina and her family, this is wealth. Lang did really well with their investment in the Pilbara, and the family became not instantly, but pretty much instantly wealth.
Yeah, and financially prosperous. Not overall prosperous, financially prosperous.
Yeah, so they got a whole lot of money just appear almost. Not that sounds downplays the hard work involved in it, but they put all their money. Lang, who's their predecessor, put all the money on red, and it came up good. But that's not what we're talking about here. You're talking about high performing families. So these are good businesses who over time have made good, sound business choices, good investment choices, had good properties, and built wealth over the generations.
It's more than that, David. It's a much more than that. So what I call a high-performing family are usually bloody good operators. That's the first thing. They know how to run the farm, they know how to build wealth, and they've got scale, and they've got leverage, and they understand how to do that. But also the key part, mate, is they're very personally aware, and they're always learning and getting outside help. So they're always trying to do better. They're very open-minded. But most importantly, mate, they invest really heavily in developing and maintaining strong, positive relationships in the family. They work on building effective communication, and they find a way as a family to work collaboratively towards a common goal.
So this comes down to the succession challenge, Ben. So the challenges now that many farmers around Australia fit into this, well, they fit into the wealth category. I don't know because I don't know them, the functional family category. The challenges now of succession and wealth transfer. So you're let's say a fairly typical farmer. you've got, let's say we take that average, you've got $20 to $50 million worth of wealth, if you've got land value and gross assets. You have one of the siblings, you have, say, 3 siblings, one who's interested in farming, 2 who've got careers like yourself, have gone off and got a commerce degree or, whatever.
A teacher or a nurse or something like
Teacher, nurse, whatever. And they've found a different career path. They love going back to the farm, but that was never going to thing in their thing. I mean, every farmer in the country is going, how the hell do I do this, Ben? So this is the big thing that I think is torturing people.
Yeah. And that's the 3-generation curse. 2 to build it, 1 to lose it, shirt sleeve to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. It's been around for donkey's ages. See, the problem I find is there's really good succession planners and professional advisors out there. The problem is, David, is they're usually addressing the problem right when there's going to be a transition of wealth. So mum and dad are transitioning out of the farming business into retirement, their version of retirement. Some that's on the beach in a unit or a house, and others it's as a board of directors, depending on the scale of the business. And then the next generation are starting to take over. So they say the son, daughter, multiple sons, whatever, is taking over the operating entity. And then off-farm siblings might be getting some cash as an early inheritance, etc. That's when they usually attack it. And usually the reason they attack it is there's some reason for it at the time. There's a pain point. And that could be mum goes eventually, had enough of this. I want to retire and get out. It could be the younger generation coming through and saying, look, I need my shot. Or it could be something like communication and trust has started to break down and we're fighting and carrying on, which makes it really, really hard. Now, I'll give you the analogy, David, which I use with families all the time, is the problem is when you approach it there, you're approaching it at the wrong time. Now, I get that there's people there now and they need to approach that. That's fine. I'm talking to the people that are 10 years out. So if you think you go down to what's the main river in Perth there, David?
Just the Swan River.
The Swan River. I can't.
Yeah, we're on the west coast. I think we only have a couple of rivers in the whole joint.
Well, let's imagine the Swan River, and that they find pollution, really bad pollution in the Swan River. Should you attack the pollution right where you find it, or should you go upstream and find where it's being polluted in the Swan River? I say swim back upstream. And the biggest problem with families is they need to swim back upstream and attack the problem at the beginning. Now, for some families, they can't turn it back into, I get they can't turn time back, so they've got to start now, but that's when people want it to be started, is earlier on.
Is it one of those old analogies, Ben, where, the best time to plant that old Chinese saying, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, the next best time is now?
Yeah, exactly. And so what we've got to look at is the reasons why succession fail, because I think you've got to understand the reason for these problems that families are having. Now, the research is really clear in my anecdotal experience over the last 25 years, but also from what I've seen from when high net worth families, there's been plenty of research studies around the world on when high net worth families try and transition wealth, what the causes of failure are. Now, a failure is essentially a loss of opportunity, a loss of wealth, or a breakdown in family relationships. They're all a failure. So it's the same for succession. Now, there's 4 main reasons why successions fail, David. The first one, which everyone thinks is the most important, is poor professional advice. Okay? It's a minuscule proportion. Most professional advisors get that stuff right. They've been doing it for years. It's like 3% of the reason. But the 3 main reasons, number 1 is a breakdown in communication and trust. Number 2 is the failure to prepare the next generation to take over. Now, I'm not talking about being bloody good farmers. I'm talking about being custodians of the wealth and leadership and personal growth. And number 3 is the failure to create an aligned strategic plan for the family.
Family Business Australia, who you may be aware of, used to do this thing where they used to talk about family charters. And it was a very similar concept, I suppose. It was like the set of rules that governs this family.
Yeah. And that's part of the solution. Absolutely. And so if you think about the reasons why it fails, you want to be putting a big chunk of your time into those 3 things. And so being a good farmer, being a better operator, being more profitable helps, but it's not going to give you the solution. So regardless of where you are on that, they're the 3 things you want to get. Now, the mistake families make around that alignment space is we're all aligned on where the family's going regarding the farm. Should we buy another farm? Should we grow canola? Should we grow cattle? Should we expand? Should we contract? That's easy. It's about the family wealth. because there's 10, 20, 30, $40 million. Where are we going this and getting everyone on the same page? We create with families what we call roadmaps, which essentially goes through and does that. But the first place most people want to start is as a family getting together and making decisions. Now, the thing with it is if mum and dad make the decisions and dictate the reasons, so this is our plan, this is what we're going to do, you guys need to all come along for the ride, it ain't going to work. You're more likely to get an estate challenge, unhappy family, and a breakdown.
Is that part of the challenge, Ben, of you're sitting there and you're the incumbent generation and you've been working your butt off, right? And you've made some big calls, you've probably almost gone broke a few times, and you're sitting here, let's say you've got it early, maybe you're in your 50s and you're sitting here and you go, wow. Is it you never take a time to sit back and go, my God, we're wealthy? You know, like you've been struggling for so long, is it a conceptual idea that you first have to get over that, okay, we now have wealth, and recognizing that's who you are now? So you're good at farming and you know how to farm, but is it it's almost like I'm now not only a good farm operator, I'm now a wealthy person. So therefore I have a new job to do.
Yeah, and that's a complex topic, which we won't even have scratch on the surface today, but you're absolutely right. The problem is a lot of families ignore this exact point because, number one, most farming families, one of their highest values is to be down to earth and grounded. Mm-hmm. You know, you don't find too many cockies these days that are ostentatious and driving a Lamborghini around telling everyone how great they are. Generally, as a society in the rural space, we value being humble and grounded. If you've got to turn around and say, look, I'm now worth 20, 30, 40, 50, I'm seeing families that are worth $500 million in farming assets. Mm-hmm. To then say, I'm no longer just a farmer, I'm a custodian of this big chunk of wealth and I'm responsible for multiple generations now, the impact it'll have on my family. It's just a big problem they don't want to even start talking about. Mums quite often do. Mums start to think about it. They're the linchpin in all this because the secret to the successful families, the number one secret, if everyone can take this away, is family financial strength is just as important as family relationship strength or the strength of the family unit. And quite often the strength of the family unit is far more important. And so when we look at families on average, it's usually mum that pops up and goes, look, we're running a successful business, but our family's not performing well, or we're not very prosperous at the moment because we're fighting, we're arguing with son and daughter-in-laws and arguing. And they start to say, we need to do more. And they see into the future, whereas quite often dad, and this is a generalization, is too busy worried about running the business day to day. Where am I going? What am I doing?
Yeah. And is it the fact that it doesn't matter? You know, there's a point in your business where it's, you know, like if you've got true purpose in your business, right? For anybody who runs a business and truly loves the challenge and the game that is their business, to them, it's actually the money isn't, apart from surviving and a way of keeping score, it actually is not the most important part of the business to them. You know, like it's a different mindset, isn't it? So you could be actually doing well and you're really happy in your business and accumulating, you know, large amounts of wealth, but you're not that interested in that. You're interested in the game that you play on the ground, which is in this case, your farm business.
Yeah, but what's the game? This is the question you've got to ask yourself, David, is what's the game here? Is the game here to build more country? Like I interviewed a family the other day with 25,000 head of cattle and 1 million acres. And like, what's the game? Is it to get 2 million acres? Is it to get 50,000 head of cattle? And he said, absolutely, Ben, that's exactly what we want to do. And he's at retirement age. He said, but what is far more important, Ben, which people forget when they're on this journey, is to keep our family unit strong. My role is to be the patriarch and my wife, the matriarch of this family, and lead us through so that my grandkids and great-grandchildren are prosperous as well. And so their role changes. They become from, this mindset has to change in families from being, I'm a farmer, to I'm a leader of the family. And I want to stress this, David, really importantly, that the families that are high performing and sustain that prosperity across generations, their central focus is family. Now, a lot of people say that and they talk a good game, but they don't do it. You know, my family's important, it's number one, but they don't give it the appropriate amount of time or effort to be able to make that true.
And does this extend, because I know, look, because I'm from farming families, it includes the new family members as well. And I know this is a challenge, right? So you've got the daughter and son-in-law challenge that gets presented, luckily for every family, hopefully. But it seems to throw another cat amongst the pigeons, doesn't it? And especially when it comes to talking about the business and the wealth, and especially if they're coming in with a new perspective and a lot of intellect and a whole lot of, they can bring, in most cases, they bring so much new intellectual horsepower to the business as well. Is that sort of part of the challenge as well? They're trying to sometimes isolate blood in this discussion as well.
Oh, absolutely. There's two key things, David, that I see. Is number one is they don't bring their kids along on the journey early enough. So, when I see high-performing families, and this is what I do with my daughter, is they have family meetings when the kids are like 7 and 8 years old, and they present them with balance sheets, profit and loss. They talk about the long-term vision. They start saying, what do you want to do with your life? Where do you want to go? They talk about family values. They talk about, where the business is going, the fact that mum and dad are the custodial owners of this family wealth, this farm, and that their job is to build it as much as we can to be able to give the next generation the opportunity to do the same thing with their children. So they start that from a young age. They're talking about values. They're talking about purpose. What's the purpose of this farm, this family wealth that we're building up, whether it be on-farm or off-farm wealth? And then when the children start to date and meet people that they might be able to hitch their wagon to, they're having conversations with their kids around the one that I love, which is your choice of spouse will make or break you. And they're starting to say things like, make sure that when you marry someone, you marry well. And I don't mean financially well, I mean values well, someone that matches you in values and vision of the future and wants to come on the journey. And then if your son or daughter chooses someone, for better or worse, they're now part of your family and you better start treating them like part of that family. Now, that might mean they've married someone that doesn't match and eventually they divorce or there's a problem there. But isolating them will be the worst thing you could have ever done.
Yeah, and I think everyone in every agricultural community has got one or hundreds of stories of the son or daughter-in-law that was cut out emotionally or financially or whatever. They're just isolated, like you said. And that just ends up breaking families every time, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, if you love your son and you have raised your son to make good decisions or daughter, whichever way, and they've chosen someone, you got to trust them. You got to trust their judgment. And I had this discussion with a family recently and where a daughter was dating someone who was less than ideal, let's say. And mum was at her wit's end. She's like, this guy's just his values are wrong. There was just multiple problems. And I said, well, you've raised your daughter to be a smart, driven young lady. She's not a dum-dum. Like, she's got really strong values. Maybe you just got to trust her. And she went back to her daughter and said, this has caused a whole lot of friction in our family, but, I've raised you to do the right thing. You've chosen this guy to have a relationship with. I trust your judgment and we'll back you. Now, this guy wasn't the right guy and we all know what's going to happen. She'll eventually break up with you, but all the friction in the family disappeared. So what you've got to be careful of, and I mean, I know there's nuances to everything. I get that. There's no right or wrong in this answer, but what you'll do is you could turn someone who could be a potential ally, a daughter-in-law or son-in-law, into a terrorist. Because if you have a family meeting, for example, once someone's married and you've invited them into, or they've been invited in the family, and then your son goes home or daughter goes home and said, we had a family meeting and all these sorts of things, and then they play Chinese whispers at home, you can have an absolute terrorist within the family. So yeah, you've got to make an effort to bring them in and include them as part of the family. And that's on-farm and off-farm siblings, regardless of what you think of them.
And that's also security, isn't it? So one of the things I see is like if you've married into a family and now you're in, that depends if you have a career. So this really depends where you are in Australia and the world, because if you're isolated and there's no possibility of you continuing your career, you now become almost a dependent. So the success and the wealth of the family is your security now, isn't it? So that can create a bunch of anxiety in its own right, doesn't it? Because you're no longer an independent person.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, the big thing is you got to because this is the big contention is what do we do with off-farm siblings? Like how my sister's in Brisbane or in Perth being a nurse or a doctor, or my brother's an engineer. We see it all the time. But again, if we've started young and we've brought them through the process and they understand wealth and they understand network and they understand values and they understand the fact that there's this big chunk of money that the family's got. but we have to make it fair and reasonable. And I'm not talking about equal is fair, just because one gets $1 and the other one doesn't get $1 doesn't mean it's unfair. But if you bring them along on that journey so they understand it, you'll be in a far, far better position. When there are times of entitlement or misunderstanding or miscommunication, you can then work through those when they're small problems instead of turning into large problems later on.
Ben, are we seeing the rise of the family office? So when you're in an urban centre like where you and I live, you see quite a number of buildings that are almost anonymous. They're these big flash buildings, often a renovated home or a whatever, and you look on the door and it's a family office, and this is a fully staffed office with a bunch of people in it, and they're there just to manage family wealth. That's the job of that office. So are we seeing the rise of the family office within rural or not?
It's always been around. I remember when I got back from London, I remember seeing a few of them in Rockhampton and wondered what they were back in those days. What the hell's a family office? And for those who don't know, essentially, it's an office that's set up. There can either be a single family office where we have an organisation that manages one family's wealth, or a multi-family office where it manages multiple families' wealth. And yeah, I think we're seeing a demand for that type of thing. And that's what I created in my coaching business, was the fact that being a financial advisor, I could see this family office was needed, but not in the same way as it has been for the non-farming families. Because the non-farming families, if they've got $100, $200, $300 million, it's usually invested in assets outside of what the family's dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So they just say, I've inherited $1 billion from my parents. How do I invest this money? And then they have professional advisors that do it. Whereas farmers are needing something far more sophisticated. It's about, you can't really have a family office to look after a farm. You don't need that. But if you've got a farm worth $100 million and then $100 million worth of off-farm assets, maybe you start looking at possibly doing that. But definitely there's a demand because, again, it's this custodial ownership of the family wealth, and it's now got more complicated. So if you are investing off-farm, how are you preparing for retirement? Mum and dad got a retirement plan. If you are building off-farm assets, what are you investing in? Where's it going? What structures are they in? How do you get all your professional advisors aligned? So you've got a bank manager, you've got a financial advisor, you've got an accountant, you've got a lawyer, all trying to do their own thing. Whereas what I've found is really successful when I've sat in the room and said, here, we've got a roadmap for this family. And you've got your accountant, your lawyer, your banker, your financial advisor all in the room. And you go, this is where the family's going. These are the values. This is the mission. This is the 10-year goals. How can each of you help? How can each of you? So then they're all aligned. And then if they don't do their job, you can fire them.
Do you know what? This is a really interesting. We have this challenge amongst our clients all the time. And you are running, generally, you're not SMEs, you're not small businesses. You're generally medium to large businesses. So you have the challenges of a medium-sized business, and you have a bunch of advisors and stakeholders within that business that you need to manage that work for you. So you have an accounting firm that works for you. Sometimes you have a business advisory or ag consulting firm that works for you. You have a banker who essentially works for you. And in many cases, you also have a law firm, and you'll also have an financial advisor. So you are the manager of those relationships. And like you say, it's important that they're all working together for you, not for themselves, independent of you, isn't it? So that's a role in itself to keep that group of advisors on your page.
Correct. Yeah. So I say the greatest way I explain it to families is I'm an advocate for your family. So I'm not a representative of any of your mum or dad or the kids. I'm an advocate for the family. So that's my interest. So what I designed a couple of years ago was I said, well, if I've got all these, I'll go back a step. Sorry, David. When I was a financial advisor, I used to get frustrated when I dealt with families. I'd try and get the accountant and the lawyer and the banker to work together to be able to structure the retirement plans for clients. So we're building off-farm assets, structuring, gearing, leverage, agreements in place, etc. And nobody worked together because they're all on their own page. Whereas when I started doing what I call advisor alignment sessions, where you get them in the room, two things you get. Number one is I've sat in rooms where an accountant has been a client's accountant for 20 years, and he stopped and looked at me and went, holy shit, I finally get where the family's going. Out for 20 years. Other families I've seen when we've gone through this process, well, we're finished and they've gone, geez, my accountant's not up to scratch, is he or she? Or my bank manager or my lawyer doesn't get it, or they're just out for themselves. So it flushes out those low performers, because the problem is with high net worth non-farming families, generally they seek out and attract really high quality advisors. What we find in the rural space is farmers are usually really loyal. So you'll quite often find they've had the same accountant for 30 years, the same lawyer for 25 years, or the same firm, and they're not sure what's good and bad. They're not going to fire them quickly. So it becomes really clear very quickly as who's not pulling their weight. And then you can get the wrong people out, bring the right people in. But sorry, just before I stop my ramble, because this is something I'm passionate about, is you also get to bring the next generation in. So they get to come in and they get to sit in the room and they get to meet those professional advisors and then be able to build a relationship and understand the technicalities of how to manage wealth.
It's actually, one thing we've seen too is it's actually pretty important for those advisors to actually get in having a good relationship with the next generation, because one of the biggest problems advisors have is the next generation comes in and go, you never talked down to me for the last 10 years and now I'm in charge. See you later. So it's important for the advisors as well to develop those relationships with the inbound generation as well, because that's fees, really.
Yeah. And I had one recently, David, where Dad had been using the accountant, and again, I'm bashing accountants here. I don't mean to. I'm just using them as an example, but they'd been seeing the accountant for 30 years. The son went in to do, and they'd made a $1.5 million profit last year. This year, they made $1 million loss. And I'm like, what the hell happened? And he's like, I don't know. I said, did your accountant tell you what happened? He's like, nope. I'm like, well, wouldn't that be the first thing your accountant would say? And he says, I don't think this bloke's up to scratch anymore. I'm like, well, you better start asking some questions, because if you're making a $1.5 million profit and then a $1 million loss, you need to know why. And that should be his job. And so he was able to then go in and go, geez, this guy's he's just been having lunch with Dad every year for the last 20 years, building a personal relationship, and he wasn't at the cutting edge of the business side.
And is that also responsibility of the farm business to understand that if you are using each of these important advisors within the business, one, that you're not shopping on price, and secondly, you let them know. For example, if you're just using your accountant to get your tax done, but they're not aware of your cash flow forecasting and modeling or your investment, and you've got them just isolated to doing BASs and smashing out a tax return, you're not giving them any insight to be able to do better anyway. And same thing, if you've got an advisor who's just helping you with, a rotational planning and cash flow forecasting, but neither of the two are aware financially of what each other's doing, then they're both operating essentially in the dark. And that might be, as owner of those relationships, your job to make sure they're both aware of what's happening, both at the going forward and going back, really, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And that's essentially a good part of the family office model, is that they essentially bring the professional advisors in to do the job, and then everyone is aligned because it's a family office. So absolutely. I've seen some professional advisors who families were complaining about the professional advisor. You did an advisor alignment session. They understood what the family's values, vision, and 10-year goals were, and it sparked something in them. They got excited. And they pick some amazing goals. And so I always tell families, if you've got a low-performing professional advisor, it's not always their fault. It could be your fault. And so sometimes we give them the opportunity to step up, and some step up beautifully. Others stay the same. Others drop the ball, because once you start holding people accountable, sometimes they can fall into a hole. And financial advisors are another one. When you go back to a financial advisor and give them a benchmark and say, they'll say, oh, we made you an X return this year. And we're saying, well, what's the benchmark we're measuring against? And, oh, we don't do benchmarks. They get quite shirty sometimes with you. So it's about knowing how to hold these people accountable and get them working the best. But you have to align on values. Sorry, David. And if you don't know your family values and you can't articulate them, then you can't find out professional advisors and build your tribe of people with similar values.
Look, this is one of my pet hates as well. So generally one of the things I find is anyone who's running a farm business now is usually a pretty clever operator, right? They know their stuff, right? And so they're not intellectually deficient in any way at all, but they somehow think that being able to hold their advisors to account is, oh, I don't understand that. That's beyond me. Ben's a smart financial guy. I'll just, whatever he says is truth. Is it this confidence to hold, no, this is what I want as a family, and asking those questions, even though, yes, you've hired specialty people to do specialty roles, which we both agree is very important, but ultimately it's your business and you can ask these tricky questions and ask why and how and all those things. Is it the confidence to push, I don't know if pushback's the right answer, but dig in.
Ask the right questions.
Ask the right questions and how to ask the right questions of all the different advisors you have advising you?
Yeah. There's an element of that, and I think that's really important for the next generation, giving them the vernacular and the confidence to be able to ask the right questions. But absolutely, I think the big mistake I see people make, and we had a huge issue over here in Queensland in 2005, 2006 with a company called Storm Financial. Lost people a lot of money. And I remember when I went and saw it, and I had financial plans come across my desk, I had 3 families that came to me for a second opinion. And I'm like, wind this up quick, smart. This is a bloody disaster waiting to happen. They didn't. They lost everything. Now, the thing was, when I looked at it, was they abdicated. They didn't delegate. There's a big difference between that. You can delegate to a professional advisor to give you advice, but never abdicate. Same with your budgets and your cash flows and all those things. Yeah, you can delegate to someone to do those, but you need to understand them. Now, you don't have to have a rocket science degree to understand the financial advice, the legals, but you've got to understand enough to be useful. And the other thing is, other value is, sorry, David, is when you have a team working together and you have a professional advisor, like your financial advisor, lawyer, accountant, they hold each other accountable. They know the questions to ask. So when I sit in the room, I sat in the room with a family recently where an accountant was giving them advice. Now, I couldn't give them the advice because I've retired from financial advice, but I remember we finished the meeting and the client said to me, Ben, how do you think that went? I said, it went okay. And they looked at me and said, don't you bullshit me, Ben. That wasn't good, was it? And I go, no. She goes, I could see your face. And the accountant was giving them the wrong financial advice. It was technically incorrect. So what we had to do then was I could identify that. A lawyer might identify that. Someone else in your network might identify that. Then we had to get a second opinion. And the second opinion was right and the accountant was wrong. And so having your other professional advisors working together sharpens that technical knowledge and you get the 1 + 1 = 3.
And talking about sharp technical knowledge, like you're a bit like me. You're a bit fond of quoting Yellowstone. And for those who don't know, it's a drama starting it's a family succession drama out of Montana starring Kevin Costner. And it's full of, I know, a bit cringy American cowboy wisdom, I'd call it.
And they're not a high-performing family.
They're not a high-performing family. To put it at their family, when they have employees that they don't want, they take them to the train station, don't they? Which means they kill them and drop them off the side of some cliffs. You're like, yeah, all right, it's a dysfunctional family. Let's just put it that way, right? But bit of cowboy wisdom. So what's his name? John. John's the patriarch guy. And in the very first episode, he was talking to his eldest son, Lee, who was running the cattle, this massive cattle operation in Montana. And he wanted to take his son, Lee, to town to meet all the advisors because they had a family office whatever, I can't remember the town.
Bozeman, I think it was.
Bozeman, yeah. And his son didn't want to come in. He goes, because I got cattle work to do and I got the calves to draft and da-da. And he goes, why won't you let me take over the business? And he goes, that's why I won't let you take over the business, because running a ranch and working a ranch are completely different things and you can't tell the difference. And that's why you're not ready, right? So do we have this problem in farm businesses just because the incoming generation are really good farmers, right? So they just know grain, cattle, sheep, horticulture. They've got that down pat. And you as an incumbent generation go, Ben, he's all over it. But he hasn't been trained or doesn't have any concept of the financial management of this business, the complexity of the debt management, legals, all this sort of stuff. So do we have this role that we may be neglecting, which is training the incoming CEOs and CFOs, regardless of their production capability?
The simple answer is yes. Absolutely. 25% of the reason wealth transfers or successions fail is because of a failure to prepare the heirs. And when I say preparing the heirs, I don't mean to be a good operator, so producing cotton, grain, cattle. It's the ability to run the business and manage wealth. So absolutely have that problem. I'll give you an example. I had a family about 10 years ago that had an extremely large cotton property. They had high levels of debt. They were very good operators. They got to 65. The son got to 40. They sold the family farm and downsized. And I said to them, what's the reason for doing this? And they said, because what we've realized is our son doesn't have the skills to manage the business, but he's bloody good, very good at growing cotton. And we can't I think this would have been 10 to 15 years ago, and it would have been 50 million back then. They said, we can't hand $50 million worth of family wealth over to him to manage because he doesn't have the skills. So they downsized, paid off the debt. They bought another farm that he could manage, and they dropped the complexity in the situation. And do you know who took responsibility for that? Mum and dad, because they'd never taught him to do it and they wouldn't let him do it. They thought they'd shelter him from that because it was during a drought in his formative years, and they didn't teach him how to do that. And they figured by the time he's 40, he didn't have the ability to do it. Now, you can argue that he could be taught and they shouldn't have done it and all this sort of stuff, but that's the position they got to because they didn't prepare him to be able to run the business of managing the wealth.
So is this like going upstream again? So it's an analogy. So if you're listening to this and you're an incumbent generation and you do have your incumbent generation might be generally these days, especially current, what I call incoming generation, are in their 30s-ish, smart. Most of them are educated really well and they know their stuff. And they're not really asking you about the numbers because they think it's boring generally. And or they're not allowed to. So either they're not allowed to or they're not sort of interested because, growing stuff's a bit more fun and that's what they love. So should you start now? Like if you've got a incoming generation coming into the business that you know about, start training them and thinking. You've got a thing I know that you've had on your podcast before, thinking like a CEO, not a producer. So does that start when your incoming generation are in their 20s really?
It starts when they're born. I mean, you need to start this process of preparing your heirs the day they're damn born because they watch you, David. So you need to be acting like a CEO for them to understand what it's got to be successful. So start with yourself. But if your kids are in their 20s, 28 to 32 is when they need to be bolted into some sort of serious responsibility. If you're after 32, you're going to start to run into pushback and conflict in the family. If they're well younger than that, they're not usually ready enough. And that's boys. Girls are much more mature and much more early.
I think girls are ready at about 5, I reckon.
Yeah, and absolutely. I grew up when I was 27. I was in London working for the hedge fund when I finally grew up. That's another long story over a couple of beers. But I can remember when I finally matured in my brain and my thinking and could think further than 2 weeks ahead. But yeah, absolutely. You need to get them. But where I think the sweet spot is as they're coming out of high school, and as they're starting to go into their own life, and you're about 10 years from potentially retiring, you're that 50, 55, maybe 45 to 50, somewhere in that bracket, that's when you need to be heavily investing. So you need to know what your values are. You need to be instilling them in your kids. You need to be telling them, these are our family values. You don't tell them these are your family values. You work out as a family what your family values are because then they're going out looking. You need to be talking about their future. Where do you want to go? Showing them that there's an opportunity here, but this is a custodial opportunity. It's not given. You've got to work for it.
And in that case of your cotton farm, is that like showing the tough bits as well? So in this case, my biggest concern is you know what you're doing. You're a good operator, and then you start getting exposed to the numbers at some point, the meaty stuff. And the numbers seem pretty easy until you have to turn to the bank and borrow $3 million for working capital to get the crop in. And then that's a lot of responsibility. That's a lot of pressure. And, the incumbent generation might, depending on how they got succession, but they've sort of grown with that pressure. They probably started borrowing smaller amounts and now they're comfortable with that. And, I don't know. But is it also getting used to that, the pressure that comes with owning the debt that's generally associated with these operations? Is it a bit of that too?
There is. And look, there's a whole, again, another topic around people's associations with money, whether we've got a scarcity or an abundant mindset. But essentially, a lot of families have this real fear about showing their kids the numbers. And the reason is 2 reasons. One is they'll freak out at the level of debt that we've got. Or number 2, they'll go, we're wealthy, I want, and they'll become entitled. The silly thing is I do this with our daughter at the moment. So she's 8. We have family meetings. We talk about money and what we're worth and where we're going and in the future and her values. Like we try and have these conversations, and there's a lot of eye rolls. But the point is we say our house is worth X amount of dollars. And whether it's worth 100,000 or 100 million, she's got no concept. And the same when kids get to 21 or 22. If you're worth 10 million or 100 million, it's just big numbers. So you might as well let them see that early on and normalize it. And again, you have to be really careful with kids to be able to let them know is what's a family conversation and family public knowledge. So for our daughter, we talk about family conversations and private information versus public. You start to teach them about that, and you start to teach them that, hey, we're worth $20 million using that example, but hey, we've got $5 million worth of debt. And that means that's probably $400,000 a year in interest repayments. And they start to go, wow, and that's all this work, and this is what pays for your school fees and all this sort of stuff. So I think absolutely you need to be letting them know what the numbers are, not hiding from them, good or bad. Now, just to be careful, you need to make it age appropriate. You don't want to be scaring the shit out of your 12 or 13-year-old kids that are going off to boarding school and saying, oh, we're going broke paying for your boarding school fees, and they feel guilty and all those sorts of things. You got to be a bit careful. But I think absolutely, if they don't know that the game of managing wealth and running a business is based on numbers. If you can't make the numbers work, you don't understand the numbers, you're going to fail. And we said the key part is you've got to be a bloody good producer to start with, and you have to know your numbers.
But it is almost table stakes, isn't it? Like being a bloody good producer of whatever you do is kind of like, okay, everyone's got to be good at that, right?
Exactly. It's like a minimum buy-in.
Yeah, and it's, and we have all good years and bad years, and sometimes we're, worse than we think we are, and sometimes we're better than we think we are, with a bit of luck thrown in. But it doesn't negate all what you've been talking about, the requirement to be a good business manager and CEO and CF and financial manager. It doesn't negate that. No matter how good you are at growing whatever you grow, that's still bloody important. And ultimately in all of us, isn't it? We're measured in money. We'd like to think, family values and how healthy the family is. And I think, I don't even know what a triple bottom line is, but there's a bit of that, isn't it? Like it's a bit of, you've got to have family wealth, you've got to have a functional family and relationships with your family, and you've got to have time to enjoy the hard work. So they're all a bit of a measure together, aren't they?
They are. And look, one of the things that I start with really early in the journey with a family is you'll say, what does a prosperous family look like?
Mm-hmm.
And you get the family as a group to say all those things. And quite often this is a generalization. Dad will say we're profitable, we're growing. Mum will say we've got good family communication. But the kids will come in and say, and this is young kids and 30-year-old kids will say, fun. And Dad will go, fun? Fencing's fun, son. And they start to
inject. We don't do fun around here.
Yeah. Fun's mustering. Like I talked to someone yesterday, and they processed 3,000 head of cattle this week. Took out 30 decks of cattle in the morning, and they're like, "Oh, this is great fun." And I'm like, "Well, it might be fun, but there needs to be other fun." But they inject those things in, and then this is subjective. But again, I've had the privilege of sitting around with people that are on their deathbed in my job over the years when I was doing financial advice. And I used to ask these old guys and old ladies, and I'd say, have you lived a good life? What would you do if you had your time again? What was important to you? And almost without exception, they come back and say, I wish I'd had more fun. I wish I'd spent more time with my family and friends. And I wish I'd given myself permission to be happy.
And is that part of it, isn't it? Like we all work so hard in our businesses, whether they be agricultural businesses or anybody's business, that we sometimes forget why we're doing it. Yes, we've got to pay those essential bills, don't we? We've got to have a roof over our head and put the kids through school and eat. But beyond that, we sometimes get so caught up in it that we forget that, okay, the whole point of this is all that other stuff.
Yeah, and that's the prime example, the wealthy family that goes, and I've had these conversations many times where you'll go, we need to start talking about, say it's succession, for example, and you say to Dad, what are you doing this for? And he's like, I'm doing this for my kids. And his kids don't like him because all he does is work, snaps at them, he's cranky, he won't talk about succession, he won't retire, he won't give them an opportunity of choice. And my question to him is, you've worked your whole life, you're sacrificing everything now for your, in inverted commas, your kids and your family. Is this really working out?
And your kids, if you ask them, probably go, well, we'd probably rather have less money and a bit more of you.
They would. And then what happens is they sit around waiting for you to drop off the perch.
Yeah, because
they're waiting for you to die because they're going, I just can't get my go, because we think the next generation wants money and the assets and all that sort of stuff. But most young people just want to go. They want to have a go. They want to prove it. They want to prove to their parents that all the things that they've taught them, they've listened to, they can succeed in life. They want to make their parents proud. when you dig into it, most of them want to.
And is that full circle back to what you said, part of this third generation curse? We can go into we haven't got really time, but this concept of purpose. The incoming generation have to have purpose beyond wealth. And is this what you're saying? So part of this third generation curse is that people might have money, but they don't have a reason to actually get up in the morning. And, people just want to get their teeth into something, don't they?
Yeah, but what's the purpose of the wealth? And so you ask a family, if you have all this money, what's the purpose of it? Is it to be hedonistic and lie around and buy Ferraris and just do nothing? And that's okay for a while, but nobody ever survives that long term. Like, everyone needs a purpose. So things that families come up with is, well, the purpose of the wealth is to be able to back our kids into their opportunity, whether they want to be a contract header driver, or whether they want to buy their own farm, or they want to set up a medical practice. We want to back our kids and give them we want to give them financial security and choices. We want to be able to educate our kids. We want to provide them with opportunities to travel the world. We want to provide them opportunities to provide for their family. We want to give them opportunity to stay on the land. Like, we've really got to think about what's the purpose of this wealth. And then when you know the purpose of the wealth, then you anchor yourself back to it. And when people don't know their values or their purpose of the wealth, they're just like a yacht that's untethered. It just floats off into the horizon and nobody's happy.
And does that mean you can get into that thing that a lot of people do? Is essentially you're working hard and you're working successful and you're doing all this, but because essentially you don't know why you're doing it, you get satisfaction out of just doing more of the same thing over and over again,
It's learned helplessness. So I'm going to share something which really was painful for me when I had my financial advice practice, and we grew a pretty good practice, and, we won awards and it was growing and it was exceptional in hindsight. At the time, I was pretty hard on myself, never thought it was good enough, but I look back now and go, it was pretty good. And I remember I thought I was doing really well at one stage, and my wife, who's very blunt with me about things, she came home one day and she goes, I don't care about the business anymore, Ben. She goes, it feels like the business gets the best of you and we get the worst. And that just cut me to the bone. It was just a knife in the heart. I looked at my little daughter, who we tried through 4 years of IVF to get, who I love dearly. And I just thought, wow. And I just was so angry with her to start with, David. I just said, I'm doing all this for you and Sophie. How dare you, essentially? I think I might have even slammed a door at some stage, which is unlike me. And then I went away and thought about it and thought, she's right. The business does get the best of me. And this is what we find with a lot of farmers is that the farm gets everything and the family gets nothing. So when we change that paradigm in our head and say we have to have some balance and what's the most important thing, and mums intrinsically get it. This is why mums are so important to the family, the matriarch. They're the heart. They're the thing that keeps the family together. On average, I'll get hung, drawn and quartered for being sexist here, but on average, the man is driving forward. Mum and dad is keeping the family together. And I tell mums that all the time, is your job is just as important as everyone else. If you're out on that farm, if you're the CEO of the company, that's fine. But also, someone's got to be the glue that holds the family together, because without the family, it will all fall apart.
And I look at the most successful families that we get the privilege of seeing through our business, and usually, nearly always, there's a really strong matriarch. Like,
absolutely,
and these are tough, successful, kind, intelligent people, right? And they're never standing in the room at the front of a conference generally. Well, these days, actually, luckily they are. Actually, more and more of these people are being celebrated these days. Or often they don't want to be anyway. But these strong matriarchs, if you look behind any of our really functional, successful, both business and families, there's always that strong, really amazing matriarch.
There is. And I think it's beautiful. And they're mostly the people that come and seek me out when I do my job, is because they're going, hubby's out in the paddock mustering or sitting in a tractor, and he goes, what the bloody hell do we need to worry about this stuff for? And mum goes, because our family's important, John or Bill or whatever their name is,
Yeah, and it can sound a bit sexist, but, at this point in our society, it's still fairly true, yeah.
It is. And to be very brutally blunt, I've seen one farming operation where it was a single woman and one where it was a single man that succeeded, and they were absolute rare as hen's teeth. Most high-performing families, or if you just want to say even financially successful, you've got a very strong driven patriarch and a very strong driven matriarch, and they work together as a team, and they're not always getting along perfectly, but they're both as driven as each other. They're both but they know their purpose. and they remind each other. And there's quite often friction because, one's saying one way and one's saying the other, but you have to have that glue. And without that glue, it all becomes for nothing and breaks apart.
And like you said, the values, are there anything like, often, I don't even know with Nat and I have been running a business together for 27 years and we disagree on so many things, but why we do it and our values and our kids are undebatable, right? Yeah. We'll just disagree on the how sometimes.
Yeah. And that's the perfect part because you don't want to be, if you've got two people that are exactly the same, why do you need the second person? That's what someone said.
Man, I wouldn't want to marry me. God help her.
Well, I had to laugh. I had a client years ago, David, that said to me, she said, can you go home tonight to apologise to your wife? And I said, what have I got to go home and apologise to my wife for? She goes, for me. She goes, I don't know how the hell she's married to you. You got a lot going on in your head.
No. I always say I've got the better deal. Hey, mate, we got to wrap it up, but I want to finish with 3 questions. You, best piece of financial advice you ever received? What made, you're a financial advisor, right? And you've managed billions.
Was.
Okay, what was the best piece of financial advice given to you?
The best piece of financial advice I ever got was keep it simple and start right now. People overcomplicate things when it comes to investing or doing things. Sometimes the best thing you can do is get started and get momentum.
Every farmer, if you had the chance to speak to every single farmer in Australia, which you might do today, about wealth management, what is the one thing you wish all of them did? Like, start here, people.
So get off farm. Get off farm and actually give this the time it needs because it's going to be just as important as the farm.
So when you're meeting, when you're thinking about this stuff, when you're addressing these big topics, get out of the farm, go somewhere else. It's a bit like companies like ours. We do offsites because people are mentally distracted when they're in the office. So it's the same thing.
Absolutely. And so we have offsite events where families come together. We call it High Performing Families. We're launching it next year where families get together, they can get off farm, they can start to think about these things and start to talk about them and surround yourself with other people that think the same way and are trying to achieve the same thing that you are.
And what do you reckon one for you is one of the biggest myths in farming in your experience?
The being a bloody good producer and making more money and building more wealth will make you intergenerationally prosperous and you'll be able to do a great succession.
And not quite the last one, but nearly the last one is, after all this, mate, you're passionate about what you do, but you can't, we're talking about the other side of people's lives. How do you wind down, right? Looking after families is a pretty intense job. I reckon being a family financial advisor and a family lawyer are probably one of the toughest jobs, right? Because everybody's family's tough, right? So what do you do to wind down outside of this, mate?
Bugger all. I like to spend time with my daughter. Exercise. I do a lot of exercise, so I like to keep fit enough. And that's been a really good balancing act, and also to spend time with my family to be able to ground me. My daughter's very stubborn like I am and my wife, and she's quite intelligent, so she keeps me on my toes, and that's probably one of the greatest joys in my life and the thing that helps me wind down.
You got 2 girls to call you out, mate.
Oh, yeah, and don't they do it.
So tell us your podcast. So where can we hear you? So can you tell us a bit about the podcast, and if people want to ask questions or find you on the interweb, how do they go about finding you and your podcast, Ben?
Excellent. So the podcast was originally the Financial Bloke. That's where I started off as a financial advisor, rebranded a while ago to Agricoach. So just go on to Spotify, Google, whatever the place you get your podcast from. Or if you want to find more details about the company I run, which is agricoach.com.au. Now, we've got a webinar coming up in August, which this may not be released before then, on succession and this exact topic and what I think families should be doing if you've hit a roadblock. So that's just go to the website and check that out. But the podcast is all about helping families become high-performing families by growing, protecting, and then ultimately transitioning their wealth. And we have lots of different guests on there from all different ways of life.
Yeah, definitely. So we both share the guilty passion of running these podcasts. So Ben, thanks very much for your time, mate. I hope as listeners you would have got a ton of advice, and we probably could speak for another 2 hours. I am going to cut this off because I reckon I've got another 2 hours of questions in me, mate. And thank you if you're still listening. Oh,
Yeah, exactly.
all right. Thanks, Ben.
So I hope you really enjoyed the episode and got some insight into what goes on in my head. And I have to say, sometimes it's not pretty. If you want to learn more about becoming a high-performing family, head on over to agricoach.com.au. Thanks for the investment of your time, and I'll see you with the next episode.